Thanks, Guy, and welcome to GA, particularly if this is your first visit. This presentation is a bit of a taster of some of our recent work that we have conducted here, particularly in social vulnerability. We are no way finished. We don't have all of the answers for all of the questions about how to solve people and disasters problems, but we are working on it, slowly but surely. This talk is actually a shorter version of a much longer talk by me and my colleague Valdis, and you have a photo of him there. And as you can see in the background, there's all of our survey forms. Now, I didn't want Valdis to miss out, and besides you see his face a bit later. In fact, he's watching. Hello, Valdis. Some of those survey forms are the tools of our trade. We actually got them out for this photo. We don't normally have them sitting around like this, but that's just one of the surveys. We now have 7. Before I'd like to go further, I would like to acknowledge our research partners. It's traditional at this point, but I have 3,000 of them. Each one represents one of our responding households. Now, our respondents have been extremely generous with their time in responding to our surveys. Someone's mobile phone. Please turn your mobile phones off. And we are very grateful for their assistance. We couldn't do this without them. Our surveys are very quantitative, but we've always given our respondents a chance to tell us their own story in their own words. And this slide represents just those stories from the 2011 floods. The bigger the font, the more times that word is mentioned. So big font means it's a big issue for lots of people. About 2/3 of our respondents actually gave us comments like this on our first survey. And we have about 100,000 words so far, and we have one large survey which we haven't started yet, so I expect that to grow quite significantly. Everything, well, not quite everything, most of the things mentioned on this slide I will touch on a little bit. So why do we study disasters? So these photos were taken by Dan Clark, who's our earthquake geologist. It's a magnitude 5.7 earthquake in Central Australia in 2012. This is actually a very large earthquake for Australia. We don't get them very often, and so they're a rare opportunity to study them. As you can see, there's a little bit of, should have worked out how to drive this before. There we go. There we go. A little bit of uplift here and a little bit of cracking. Doesn't look particularly fancy or anything. It looks kind of cute in some ways, a little bit of lift. The significant thing about this earthquake is that it's not a disaster, but it's the same magnitude as this earthquake. A magnitude 5.7 earthquake hit Newcastle in 1989. 100 people were injured, 12 people were died, billions of dollars of damage. This is a disaster. This is also a disaster. 33 people died in the floods of 2010 and 11 across Queensland, and 3 remain missing. On the 10th of January, 16 people died in Grantham alone, and the 3 people missing come from that community in that day. This is actually 2 disasters, different but related. 173 people died in the Black Saturday fires in 2009. But if the fires hadn't happened, the headlines would have been about how twice that number died in the heat wave that occurred at the same time. So that little quiet feeling you probably all have right now is only half the reason why we need to study these disasters. The other half of the reason is because we're not powerless. Like these lilies which I spotted and photographed growing out of the ashes in the Black Saturday bushfires, we can grow out of disasters bigger and better. Typhoon Haiyan devastated large areas of the Philippines earlier this year, with thousands were killed. Yet many people reported how the Balangkayan town hall proudly declaimed, 0 dead, 0 injured, 0 missing. They had spent a lot of effort in their disaster resilience, and it had paid off for them. Likewise, in Australia, we've invested in building standards, planning procedures, warnings and evacuation. And so direct cyclone deaths on land in Australia are now rare. In fact, I tried to graph it and it was nonsensical. I couldn't make it look like anything. They're so unusual now. This house illustrates the perfect reason why we have building standards. Our friends in the US Army Corps of Engineers who gave us this photo told us that this house was the only one on this coastal strip when Hurricane Ike hit in 2008 that was built to building standards. It's a good investment, doesn't it? The people built this house after they lost the original house in Hurricane Rita in 2005. And incidentally, they've gone back. They're living there and they've actually built a restaurant across the road. So, also to higher building standards, so unlike their neighbours. GA has been doing social research in vulnerability for some years now. Plenty of people know all about our hazard research. We've been doing that for quite some time. And even our engineering work, we've had a well-established engineering program. But the social program is just not as prominent for some people. It started with the cities projects in 1999. So that's, what, 16 years now, 15 years now that we've been doing this. And we've contributed to many other projects, and probably the most dominant since is the 2009 bushfires. Now the thing is, all of our work up to then has always been using external data. It's all been very quantitative and it's using external data that has not been collected specifically for the reason of assessing disasters. Following the floods in 2011 and Cyclone Yasi, we went to these areas to collect damage surveys, part of our building, our engineering capability. And while we were there, we were collecting stories. Not because we were there collecting stories, but because people wanted to tell them to us. And the stories led us to asking questions between ourselves. So we decided to start our own project and try and answer some of those questions. A little bit of movie. You can watch this, you don't have to watch me. So this represents our respondents from our Brisbane and Ipswich surveys. We did two, one in 2011 and 2013. We're just going to zoom in a bit because it's quite large. So what we have here is the Ipswich CBD. The houses in orange are the ones who have responded to both our surveys, and the houses in yellow, just the first survey. What we have here is the Bremer River, which flows through Ipswich, and this blue footprint is actually the 2011 flood footprint. So that's the flood extent. Anything under that was flooded. We have 1,267 respondents for our first survey. This is where the Bremer River joins the Brisbane River. So here's the Brisbane River here. That represented a 26% response rate, which is quite high for a survey of this type. Our second one, we had 436, which was a 61% response rate from a smaller sample, so we were thrilled with that. We're getting into outer Brisbane area here. This is the Centenary suburbs, and we've got Westlake, which went under, Jindalee. You can see the feature of the creeks here, in particular Oxley Creek's just coming in on screen now. The thing about these Brisbane floods is the complexity of them. It wasn't just the river that flooded, the creeks flooded, and in a lot of cases the stormwater backed up too. We've got Graceville and Chelmer here, which went under significantly. Fairfield. For those cricket fans, the Gabba's okay. Suncourt Stadium didn't do so well. As you may remember the photos of King Wally and his floaties. This is the Brisbane, well that's the Brisbane CBD and the New Farm type area, and Bulimba at the end here. The floods did go further. We didn't survey further than this. The number of households affected is much lower. And now this is a 40-kilometre spatial extent from Bulimba all the way up to Western Ipswich. That's quite a large area, and that's what's unique about a lot of our surveys. They have large spatial extents, whereas a lot of other researchers tend to go into 2 or 3 suburbs and they just do those suburbs, whereas we've done a lot of suburbs, but less people in each suburb. So I mentioned we received a lot of free text comments as part of our surveys, and I'd like to show you some of the stories we received from the 2013 floods. The story I'm about to show you is not unique. Might be a little distressing for the children, I'm sorry, or for anyone for that matter. It's very powerful, actually. It was in the middle of a very long story, and it hit us all. Handwriting's a little unusual, so I'll read it to you. On the 28th of January 2013, the warnings on the radio by the Brisbane City Council were quite dire. But we felt we had to be prepared, and my husband, myself and 2 family members moved a lot of our furniture higher up. It was an awful day, and with the prospect of flooding, my husband died of a sudden heart attack that evening. We don't and we can't know if this gentleman died because of the flood. It is likely that he had an underlying condition that meant a heart attack would have happened anyway. However, we do know that stress and physical exertion, in this case moving their furniture, do bring them on. If it weren't for the flood, maybe he would have gone to the doctor and had it noticed, his underlying condition. Maybe he wouldn't have ignored the warning signs. Maybe it wouldn't have been as bad. We don't know. Not all the stories are this dire. There are several deaths. Some of them do actually have quite positive outcomes. And since I read the last one, I'll read bits of this one too. Life's lessons were reinforced during this period. The importance of good family and friends who are irreplaceable. Unlike all the unnecessary clutter that we accumulate throughout our lives, it was actually a great time for bringing our neighbours and community together. These events will forever be etched in our memories. I'm sure these people never wanted to be flooded, even now. No, we didn't want to be flooded. I'm sure they'd be better off without it. But they've grown as a family through it. They've found positive outcomes. They're much happier in their place in life. And this is not an unusual story. We have several of these stories. A lot of people reported that they're much happier now. So, with a postal survey like this, how you phrase your questions is very, very important. So one of the things we wanted to know is, what was the trigger that made you think you were going to be flooded? So we phrased it this way. Did you receive a warning to prepare yourself? We thought that would be fairly straightforward, but obviously people in Brisbane and Ipswich have a different idea of what a warning is to what we do. No warnings except those on TV. By then we had moved everything. Okay. Timing too late. Had started to raise furniture. Same problem. How did you know? Didn't get any, only from radio. Now I mentioned this one specifically because ABC Radio is the official emergency broadcast. If you hear something on the radio that says you need to get out, please do, really. Don't and ah. If you're going to check with emergency services. Though they're probably overwhelmed if they're telling you to get out. So that is a warning. And this one's my favourite. Too busy packing to have time. How did you know to pack in the first place? Really, that's what I wanted to know. How did you know to pack? So anyway, that being said, we pressed on and we've analysed this data. Not everyone had those responses. A lot of people seem to understand what we were trying to get at. So I'd like to introduce you to 1% man. Now 1% man actually represents 1% of our responding households. So I'm going to show my data through this. For 2011, more than half of our respondents did not hear a warning, 54%. I heard it in Canberra. I can tell you, I was watching the gauges as they went up. So, okay, let's tease this out a little bit more. We actually asked whether people thought the warnings they heard were relevant, which was actually enlightening. Now, this is actually really complicated, so I'm going to step through it slowly, but I'll explain it as I go and you'll understand why. So of the total population, whether they heard a warning or not, 38% heard the warning and thought it was relevant. So great. That's the sector of the population where it's working for. 9% heard the warning but didn't think it was relevant. So obviously we need to look more at the warnings to see how we tailor it to them to make them understand that this means you. 27% didn't hear a warning, but the warning they didn't hear was not relevant. Now, this seems funny at first, and this is where it gets complicated. It gets worse, trust me, but they obviously heard something going on in the background. There was some chatter on the radio, there was some talk about something coming, but they didn't hear that as a warning, and therefore they didn't think it was relevant. So for them, obviously we need to make that chatter actually a little more official, make it in their face a little more, and then maybe they'll start thinking about whether this is relevant to them or not. 20% didn't hear a warning, and therefore they didn't comment on whether it was relevant or not. So these people didn't get a message at all of any kind. At least their memory says they didn't get a message of any kind. You have to remember this is 15 months after the flood, and the memory is fragile, so they may have forgotten since. And then I have 6% who didn't hear a warning, but the warning they didn't hear was relevant. I think this is the same as our 20% who didn't hear the warning and thought it was not relevant. I'm pretty sure they heard some kind of chatter going on the radio in the background, and at the time it didn't mean anything to them. But after the fact, they have used those faulty memories, and they've supplemented it with what they've read in the paper to think that, yes, what I heard was actually relevant. So again, we need to go back to looking at that chatter to see how we can make it much more prominent as a warning. We asked the same question following the 2013 floods. Now, 2013 was a much smaller event, yet 71% of people heard a warning. Nearly all of these people didn't get flooded and were not at any risk of flooding. So the warnings were much more prominent for them, even though it wasn't relevant to them. That's something we need to tap into. You can't talk about the Brisbane floods without talking about Wivenhoe Dam. Wivenhoe Dam is very important to our respondents' understanding of what happens in a flood and what their risk is. Most of them have one view of what it is there for. Wivenhoe Dam will save us. Da-da-da-da. Unfortunately, it didn't save them, and the reality is a dam, even a flood mitigation dam, cannot save everyone from every flood situation. They're only built for certain floods. It gets to a certain point and it can't do it. I grew up in Brisbane. Well, I didn't grow up in Brisbane. I lived in Brisbane for a few years, and I know the mantra well. Brisbane doesn't flood anymore because of Wivenhoe Dam. It's part of the culture. It's a cultural thing you have to break. Instead of showing more facts and figures, I'm going to do a bit of a case study, and this is where Valdis comes back in again. In May this year, Valdis and I attended a disaster conference, and Valdis noticed that there was a lady presenting a poster called Tegwin. Now, if Tegwin had been called Mary or Jane, he wouldn't have noticed that Tegwin had also responded to our 2011 and 2013 surveys. So we took the opportunity, and whether she liked it or not, we bailed it up, and she was actually quite happy to talk to us. And she told us her story, her family story, and we have permission to share her story now. Tegwin has a husband and dependent children, a typical family, like 32% of our respondents. This is a picture of her house taken before the 2011 floods. It's a low-set home. Behind the house is a swimming pool, and behind that is the Brisbane River. It's a nice home in a nice area, nice and green. This is Tegwin's home after the floods. The water level represents about 1.5 metres. This is typical of what a home looks like when it's been flooded. That brown carpet is actually a thick layer of mud. The mud and the water will be all through the electrical, it'll be in the wall cavities. Any furniture or your kitchen cabinets that are made of MDF or particle board will be starting to swell and they will fall apart. If you hadn't removed any of your books, your artworks, your videos, they would now all probably be in a stinking pile out on the neighbour strip where the mud army, the spontaneous volunteers who help clean out the houses, will have placed them. The house would stink. I can tell you it stinks. And a few days later, mould will start to grow. It's a pretty horrific situation. Initially, they went to a friend's house, as did 39% of our respondents, and then they went to rented accommodation, as did 21%. Only 6% initially went to an evacuation centre. People generally don't go to an evacuation centre unless they have no other option. And that's not just here in Australia, it happens around the world. The home was deemed to be a write-off in October 2011, and in October 2013, when we did our follow-up survey, they were still living in rented accommodation. Our survey results show that on average households were away from their homes for 92 days, but if you were a household with very young children under 5, or you had insurance, or if the water levels were particularly high, then it was much longer than that. There was still work to do, as there was for a quarter of our survey respondents. And the insurance payout didn't pay for anything, so our estimates were that that the insurance covered $1.5 billion worth of damage, but households had to find $1.3 billion to cover repairs, landscaping, pools, fences, sheds. All of these things are not covered by insurance. This is a good photo of flood mud. The stuff is sticky, it smells, you can't get rid of it. Cleaning your shoes afterwards is horrible. Flood mud contains lots of things like bits of metal and broken wood and dead animals, and it also contains things you can't see, like nasties like bacteria from overflowing sewage, chemical runoff. It's not good stuff. Many of our respondents talked about children in particular having infections from cuts they got on their feet. 26% of households were injured. Tegwin's family had someone who was injured and hospitalised. The story here is don't go anywhere near flood mud unless you absolutely have to. And don't swim in floodwaters because it contains flood mud. Floodwaters are not an opportunity to swim. You will get sick. This is their home today, completely different. While rebuilding, they were impacted by a shortage of tradespeople, as is a quarter of our respondents. The household suffered from a loss of income. 38% of respondents reported that their household was reduced, income was reduced for a variety of reasons. Either their place of employment was closed, they couldn't get there, or they were cleaning up their house or volunteering to help clean someone else's house. The income reduction lasted on average for 89 days. That's 3 months on a reduced household income. If you add that to the stress of the health effects of trying to rebuild your house, of the financial effects, then you start getting an idea of what these households went through. The household took on extra employment to cover the costs. They had support issues, the children had mental health issues, they had problem accessing services, they had health problems. None of these points are uncommon. Many of our respondents reported these sorts of issues. Tegwin's house has been razed, as you can see. That's actually quite unusual. Only 5% of our respondents said they had razed their houses. You can see an example from one of our surveys that's immediately post-floods, and they've lifted it quite a way now. Most of our respondents repaired like for like. Just like this house here, you can see it white and now it's green. Not a big change. But I'd like you to note the house next door. That's been raised. So this house was flooded to 2.4 metres, about the level of the eaves What's going to happen next time it floods? Tegwin made a number of other modifications to her house to make it more flood resilient, but what the numbers on this slide show is that actually it's uncommon. People generally didn't make changes to their homes. An interesting point is that 8% of households in our follow-up survey for 2013 reported that actions that they had taken post-January 2011 to improve their resilience resulted in their dwellings sustaining little or no damage. So that's 8% of people who it was of benefit for within 2 years. Mind you, raising the house isn't for everyone. I wouldn't want to climb those steps every day, and particularly some of the houses we've seen are up to 6 metres off the ground. I couldn't, well, it might be sensible, but I can't climb 6 metres, baby on one arm, shopping in the other every day. Particularly as my baby gets bigger. Tegwin had to learn how to rebuild her house, how to prepare and everything herself. So she got together with a whole bunch of her mates and they put together this report, Preparing for Natural Disaster. If you're interested, you can find it yourself. If just Google flood, fish, disaster, you'll find it. It contains 24 pages of information about how to prepare for a disaster based on their own experiences. It's a positive that can come out from disasters, something to help next time. Now, Tegwin's story is an insurance story, so insurance featured strongly in our comments, some of them good and some of them really not good. At the time of the 2011 floods, there was multiple definition for flooding in your insurance. Now, that has changed as a result of the Commission of Inquiry recommendations out of the 2011 floods. So if you have a policy, you will know that your definition flood may or may not have changed, depending on what you were covered for in the first place. But with the different types of flooding and the different levels of cover and the complexity of the Brisbane event, it meant that some people only received a partial payout for the damage. Insurance was seen as a double-edged sword for many respondents. Some felt that dealing with the insurance company was more stressful than the flood. However, others felt that I would be in that case in a mental hospital if I didn't have it. It has good and it has bad. And incidentally, I don't know that I noticed much difference in company with this. If they told us, we didn't ask. In recent times, households have seen some very sharp premium increases going from between $800 and $1,000 a year to $3,000 to $4,000 a year, and even as much as $9,000 a year. Our initial 2011 survey found that 19% of respondents' insurance was unaffordable or they were not eligible, and another 10% didn't even look. Now, our responses from the 2013 survey seem to imply that number is much higher, so 29% at least do not have any kind of flood insurance. We asked, because we knew this was an issue, whether people thought they had insurance or not, so we asked whether they thought they had insurance. 71% of our respondents thought they had insurance prior to the floods. However, the number of successful claims was somewhat different. So of the total people, whether they thought they were total population, whether they thought they were insured or not, 32% received a full claim, and for purposes of this is 90% of the damage or greater. Another 13% received a partial claim, and sometimes it's as less as 10% of the damage. And 55% received no claim whatsoever, or they didn't apply. So about 26% of our respondents thought they had insurance going into the floods, and it turned out they had nothing, with as many as the 13% only having a small amount. It's almost opposite. The 2013 event had a range of impacts on people. For some, it was basically a non-event. Oh yeah, there were some floods. We even had one woman ring up and say, "We didn't flood, though. There was no flooding in Brisbane. Really? You got the wrong city." There was flooding, it just wasn't anywhere near as big. However, it did have a big impact on some households. This first one in particular, my wife had a significant trauma response. They've had to move, they've had to start a new life. And they weren't flooded. None of these later respondents were flooded. So it doesn't have to have water in the house to have an impact on you. We asked when it rained heavily whether people felt anxious or nervous as a kind of test of what the mental health of people was like. We found 72% said yes every time it rained in Brisbane. That's a lot of trauma. The emotional strain had a varying amount of impacts on families. Some it actually brought them closer together. It was positive. For some it drove them apart, and in some cases permanently through separation or divorce. And occasionally one partner was left behind with a damaged house, a written off car, the kids, and the other partner absconded with the insurance money. This is not actually an unusual story. You might be surprised how often this happens, and it's very common in the US. Domestic violence skyrockets after a disaster. Domestic violence orders often triple or quadruple following a disaster. Separations increase. The strain on families is just incredible. So back to Tegwin's pool. There's no way other than to just scoop the mud out and clean it herself. And the kids refused to do it, so Tegwin had to do it herself. In May, she sent us this photo. She'd finally got the pool sparkling again, but it had taken 3.5 years to do so. The message here is that a natural disaster might come and go in a week, and even just rebuilding the house might happen in a shorter time. But the emotional and the financial and the physical impacts can go much longer than that. But like the lilies growing in the ashes, people can grow from disasters. But more importantly, we as a society can grow from disasters. We can learn how to do things better. We can improve building standards. We can improve the way we send out our messages. So we can, hopefully we'll be able to stop calling hazard events a disaster. And if you want to find out more, I'll actually be down at the hazard stand at the far end of that building after this. Any questions?